to understand and dissect, interrogate the Grenada Revolution and its significance, not only to Grenada, but and beyond. And this evening, we're happy to be here for another very important keynote address. We had Professor Merle Collins last evening speaking to us on the haunt of history, Grenada's story, moving toward the future. And it was a very inspirational, informative, and it really did stimulate our imagination. And this evening, we are happy to have His Excellency Dr. Jules to speak to us on education in the revolution and the revolution in education. Now, before we get into the lecture, because this evening is about education, we wanted to ensure that we involved the young people in showcasing some of their talent. So I want to invite at this time Fabian Ferguson to do a poem for us, Serve and Protect.
Can you hear me? Imagine fighting for your right to gain an education. Imagine dying for your right to live. Picture yourself marching for peace. Picture yourself in the shoes of your grandparents and answer me this question. What would you do for your country? Are you willing to stand with the ones who denounce the laws that control us? Or are you in the minority that will conform? Are you willing to put your head on a brick and support a vision that is not certain? Are you satisfied with your current position? Are you willing to march in protest against your leaders, knowing that there is a risk of being caught in the crossfire? Are you willing to go up against uniformed men with a title that was set to give a sense of security against to citizens? I want you to look at the individual next to you. Are you willing to hold hands with that person and walk the streets for hours? Or are you the weak link that will break the chain at the sight of incoming danger? I'm only asking you this because I'm not. I'm not willing to put my life on the line like my grandparents did. Yeah, I know I'm selfish, but I didn't grow up in an era where this was norm. I grew up in an era where if someone is murdered, it makes the front paper of every newspaper. I grew up without a curfew at the break of dawn. I grew up knowing that I didn't have to fight for something that I should have as a child. I know I sound unpatriotic, but I cannot imagine myself in this situation. Is this the time, the end of mankind? At this moment, several police stations have already put up a flag of surrender. What kind of era have we entered? Why do I have to fight to survive when God already gave us life? Why couldn't we live peacefully? Why couldn't we do what's right? Why does my freedom have to be stripped from me because of selfish human beings? You may or may not agree with me, but I am glad that my grandparents fought for me. I get chills when I see what's happening, an uprising that is frightening. I felt terrified for my own safety. I was tired of living life so risky. I wanted to learn, I wanted to grow. Didn't want to live under these barbaric rules anymore. I wanted peace and freedom to walk around freely without having to think about getting home to my family. I wanted security that didn't mean I had to give up my rights, and a government that wouldn't delay my succession's flight. But on the other hand, I also can't see myself like this. Surrender now or be killed, and give us the man that opposes us. Any slander or false claim will bring negative results. On the floor with your hands on your head, resisting is useless. You will be on the floor if you're dead. Form a straight line, but you just told us to lay down. Shut up and do as I say, now. I couldn't see myself being as strong as they were back then, but that's because I was born in an era where the need for protesting is dead. History books only teach you that much, right? But maybe if I could go back in time, maybe I'd have a change of heart. Maybe I'd learn what it takes to fight for your country. Or maybe if I were born back then, I wouldn't have written this in the first place. Thank you.
Poem that speaks to some of the generational shifts in terms of how we organize, in terms of how we resist. And for the last couple of days, we had a number of school children. Today, in fact, we had 75, and tomorrow we anticipate 81 students from secondary schools. So we want to ensure that this conference provides that space for young people to know once again how to resist, how to protest, and so forth. So we want to thank you for this. I want to acknowledge the Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Education, Mr. Andel. Welcome. We'll now have a dance performance. Revolution was no joke, by two students, while Fabian is a psychology major. The students coming to us now are a psychology major and a sociology major. Kennedy Henry and Darvin Clouden, help me invite them for a dance performance. Are they around? Put in the back. Okay. Could someone signal to them? Oh, okay.
Goodness and mercy all my life shall surely follow me. And in just forevermore, my dwelling place must be. Goodness and mercy all my life shall surely follow me. And in just forevermore, my dwelling place shall be.
I wish to thank Kennedy Henry and Darwin Clouden for that dance. Revolution was no joke. Let's give them another. And if I may say, tomorrow we have 3 plenaries. There's one in the morning on the life and legacy of Maurice Bishop. There is a set 2 in the afternoon, one that we've called Voices from Within, because we understand that there is still collective pain, there are still silences, and we wanted to provide an opportunity for Grenadians to come and just talk, just transcend the silence. So that plenary is free, Voices from Within. And the final plenary tomorrow is called History, Memory, Reconciliation, and Healing. That's the final plenary. You know, when they came down to the march, march into Forward March, it brought back a lot of memories, because that was like the anthem of the Grenada Revolution. Forward march against imperialism. Y'all remember that? We still have to forward and march against imperialism. So I want to invite all of you who can make it tomorrow. It will be the final day of the conference. And we would really do a deep introspection to arrest some of the ghosts that still haunt us and deal with the silences as we go forward. So I really want to thank these 2 young people and the one before who did the poem. But I want to now invite Dante Wilkes, who is doing a double major in psychology and sociology, and he will do a poem for us. What makes a Grenadian revolutionary? Dante.
Good night once again. What makes a Grenadian revolutionary? What does revolution look like through your eyes? Would you call the people beside you right now enemies or allies? Look around you and tell me what type of people you see. Will they notice something wrong and have the courage to disagree? Could you count on them to march with boots on the ground, forward ever to fight against that imperialistic sound? Personally, I'm not completely sure that I would know, because it is said that people will always reap what they sow. Yet, the seeds of our powerful and strong nation were sown, but they reaped a leader who treated government as their throne. Bias and intimidation were easy tactics to enforce silence, and if those did not work, it was not a far stretch to use violence. People hold many different perspectives to this revolution story, attributing some people to its downfall and others to its glory. The melting pot of opinions shrouds the truth in an air of mystery, as we choke on how many significant parts are left unclear in our history. And if history is told by the victors, who knows what is truly right? So, that shared experience should not cause us to divide, but instead to unite. Revolutions and revolutionaries do not materialize out of thin air. They are the response to conditions that a people cannot bear, environments weaved with the heartbeat of enough is enough, becoming the flame that empowers them to call their oppressors bluff. And if you view education and medicine as a human right, you too would understand part of the reason to stand and fight. So here we are, years after that revolutionary point in time, where some see the events as justice while others see unforgivable crime. Whether you think we shouldn't have had revolution in the first place, or the fact that we haven't had another one by now is a disgrace, the people of this beautiful nation are all products of that revolution. So let us march forward ever, away from conflict and focus on solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dante. And I'm really happy to see the young people engaged in a discourse on the Grenada Revolution. And I want to encourage you to continue to study it, research it, and make sense of it, even in your generation. Now it's my pleasure to invite Professor Damian Graves, an associate professor here at St. George's University, to introduce our keynote speaker. Professor Graves.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Good night, gentle people. You know, it's a pleasure to introduce my very good friend, His Excellency Dr. Didicus Jules, who assumed the post of Director General of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States in May 2014. In his capacity, he is responsible for driving the regional integration thrust towards a single economic and social space involving 10 Eastern Caribbean states. From 1979 to 1980, Dr. Jules served as coordinator of the literacy campaign and was responsible for the establishment of the Center for Popular Education. From 1981 to 1983, he held simultaneous appointments as Chief Education Officer and Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Education, Culture, Youth, Sports, and Social Affairs. Dr. Jules has had extensive regional and international experience, most of it focused on education, social policy, and organizational transformation. He served as Registrar and Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Examinations Council between 2008 and 2014, leading a thorough modernization of the council. He has also served as Vice President of Human Resources, Cable and Wireless, St. Lucia, 2005 to 2008, Permanent Secretary for Education and Human Resource Development, St. Lucia, 1997 to 2008, that glorious period. He has provided consultancy services to national governments, regional and international organizations in the Caribbean, Africa, Europe, and North America. He chaired the World Bank's Vision 2020 Committee on Education in the Caribbean, was a lead expert in the development of the CARICOM HRD, or Human Resource Development Strategy, and has served on many private sector educational and philanthropic boards. He holds a Bachelor of Arts honors from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, an MSc in Curriculum and Instruction, and a PhD in Educational Policy and Curriculum and Instruction from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, as well as an MBA from the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill. He has authored several articles on education policy, education reform, and adult education in the Caribbean and in small island states, as well as other publications on public sector reform, organizational transformation, and cultural studies. His career has been characterized by visionary, transformational initiatives aimed at making Caribbean institutions more responsive to the needs of people, more competitive in the global arena, and more efficient and sustainable. He's a vocal advocate of educational transformation in small island states. Gentle people, please help me welcome to the podium the man of transformation, His Excellency Dr. Didicus Jules.
Protocol established. Good night, comrades. I would like to ask you to turn to your right or your left and buckle your seatbelts because we have a long ride ahead. I want to start by thanking the committee responsible for the 40th anniversary for this initiative of the restoration of memory. I have repeatedly said that historical amnesia is one of the most debilitating conditions that a people can suffer. Yeah, and it's no different from the affliction of Alzheimer's in a family. Your memory fades, then one only intermittently remembers and recognizes family and friends, and in the end one does not recognize him or herself. And finally, all that's left is the vacuum. The American academic and cultural activist Henry Giroux speaks of the desert of organized forgetting, which is very applicable in the Grenada context. While we must accept responsibility for the collapse of the revolution, there is no question that it has been the victim of the most concerted campaign of organized forgetting by those who wish to obliterate this episode so rich with lessons for the future. Our willingness to confront our past, our unwillingness to confront our past debilitates our ability to manage the present and to shape our future. We are reminded of the words of the Greek tragedian Achilles, that, and I quote, he who learns must suffer. And even in our sleep, pain that cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart. And in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom to us by the awful grace of God. In tonight's act of remembering, let us also pray for the wisdom that can come from the awful grace of God, because Grenada has paid a heavy price in blood for the lessons from which this wisdom cometh. My presentation has several parts, 5 sections. I want to start by looking at the contemporary crisis of education in the Caribbean, why the Grenada experience matters, the context, the Geary inheritance, education in the revolution, and the revolution in education. To counter this organized forgetting, I would like to put some things in historical context. The first is a conclusion of a study conducted by Professor Patrick Emmanuel, Grenadian, in 1986. And I note 1986, while both the trauma of the internal conflict and the aftermath effects of the US Cyclops operation were still very raw. And that study was on political change and public opinion in Grenada. And its conclusions, 77.2% of respondents indicated that the People's Revolutionary Government had always been popular, with 5.9% indicating it was never popular. The study also provides assessment on specific conditions under the PRG, which speaks volumes to the sophistication of the Grenadian masses. So all the greens are what people said improved. The intense greens were, excellent improvement. The lighter greens, moderate improvements. I want to draw your attention to show you the sophistication of and why we need to respect the masses. Freedom of speech was the one thing that people said was worse. But how do you explain legal rights being improved 60.9%? So while on the one hand, people understood that the freedom of speech was curtailed, on the other hand, legal rights, the rights of women, of workers, significantly augmented by the revolution. The one statistic I want you to keep throughout tonight in the forefront of our exploration of the transformation of education is the lifespan of the revolution. 1,681 days. In fact, I'm writing my own personal reflections on it, and the title of the book is 1,681 days. The revolution was born on March 13, 1979, and as far as some of us are concerned, it died on the 19th of October, 1983. And just to juxtapose, a 5-year electoral cycle in our normal Caribbean is 1,825 days. So as we undertake this journey, keep this statistic in mind. I want to turn to the crisis in education in the contemporary Caribbean. Let's take a quick look at it and use this to frame the exposition of the education transformation effort undertaken during the revolution. This, I hope, will better contextualize the quality of thinking and the intensity of action that characterized that effort. Education in the Caribbean generally followed the same historical trajectory from post-emancipation to post-independence. On this journey, there were some significant indicators of progress. And quickly, for example, every country, nearly universal access to primary and secondary education, so a wider educated demographic. Average age, years of education attainment moved from 4.6 years of average schooling in 1960 to 10.3. Significant expansion of tertiary, regional benchmarking of secondary exams. But there are some contemporary, our educational progress has been fettered by some uncritical adherence to the legacy of empire. There's been no critical and systemic deconstruction of this colonial inheritance, and a redefinition of education to serve a transformational socio-political agenda. Immutable paradigms prevail, and despite increased access, our education systems throughout the Caribbean remain fundamentally elitist. Our education systems are plagued with many problems that are all related to the legacy of this unquestioned colonial paradigm. So we have things like low access to early childhood, low school performance, imbalance in subject entries, and school graduates with inadequate skills. These are all things that we quarrel about constantly. But inequity in the system expresses itself in many ways. There's unequal provision, so resourcing differentials between private and public schools, rich and poor, male and female, urban and rural schools, the quality of staffing. There's the issue of socioeconomic status and the cultural impact of education in the home. More educated parents, less educated parents, the impact of that on their kids, nutritional status, and in today's world, the issue of the digital divide. A consequence of this is that failure has now become systemic, and nowhere is this more glaring than a 20-year analysis of CSEC results that revealed that 66% of the cohort sitting exams attained between none and less than 2 subjects. Now this is all candidates in a 20-year period sitting CXE exams. 12% obtained 3 to 4 subjects, and only 22% obtained 5 or more subjects, which is widely recognized to be the benchmark for decent wage employment. Now, when you see that statistic, there's something fundamentally wrong. It cannot be that teachers' inability to teach. It cannot be students' inability to learn. It is the fault of the system. Failure here is systemic. Elsewhere, I have argued that whereas in the post-emancipation period, education was the primary instrument of social emancipation. In the post-colonial, post-independence period, it has now become a central instrument of social stratification. And this perspective is substantiated by ECLAC, which pointed out in 2011, and I quote, that the region has failed to transform the education system into a powerful mechanism for equalizing opportunity, partially because a deciding factor in educational achievement and results is found in the environment and available income in the home. Advances made during the past decades in terms of coverage, access, and progression in the different cycles of education have brought about a stratification of learning outcomes and achievements in the education system. And this inequality is usually reflected in a clear segmentation and stratification of the quality and efficiency of the education provision system itself. So, is that clear enough? So, let's talk now about why the Grenada experience matters. It takes us to this question. It matters in essence because Grenada represents the most comprehensive and strategic effort in the shortest time, 1,681 days, in the post-independence history of the Caribbean to overhaul the education ecosystem. Not just the education system, the education ecosystem. It makes explicit what Paulston, Popwitz, and Tabashnik and them call the central influence of ideology and power in the attempt to alter values and structures. It illustrates the importance of context because it shows how central the discourse of education reform was to the rhetoric of the revolution and the legitimation of the transition state. It also elucidates the organic dynamic of how the idea, the vision gives shape to the system that must be infused with content which requires processes and ways of doing consistent with that vision. You see the interconnectedness of it all. Context is everything. In all of this, the experience of the Grenadian Revolution was not new because over the ages, thinkers have always articulated lofty goals of education. From Martin Luther King, Plato, Socrates, to John Dewey. Right? Martin Luther King talks about the function to teach one to think intensely and think critically. Pluto talks about the purpose of education, give to the body and to the soul all the beauty and the perfection of which they are capable. And this one, my favorite from Socrates, that education is not the filling of a vessel but the lighting of a flame. So what makes Grenada matter is that it sought to actualize the assertion by Dewey that the conception of education as a social process and function has no definite meaning until we define the kind of society we have in mind. And that is what differentiates what happened in Grenada in the 1,681 days from other attempts in the Caribbean. So the context now, the Geary inheritance. As I now turn to the pre-revolutionary context, which has to be addressed in the early effort at education transformation, it will further reinforce why the Grenada experience matters. Grenada was the first OECS country to gain independence from Britain in 1974. And it did so in a context of unprecedented political instability and a demonstrated tendency to autocratic government, which I didn't say but was highlighted in the Duffus report. And to avoid any suspicion of political selectivity in what I'm going to present to you here in this section, I will draw solely from international, external, and pre-revolutionary reports of the Ministry of Education itself. And here is the summative picture. On the economic front, a study by British Crown agents in 1972, depicts structural changes in the economy, showing a decline in agriculture, the emergence of a small, light manufacturing sector, and an uptick in tourism, while there were significant increases in the size of government bureaucracy between 1965 and 1970. It warned that while some jobs would be created in tourism, prospects for significant increases in employment in other sectors were poor, and that the number of persons seeking full-time employment would increase to 10,000, while those seeking part-time employment would increase to 4,000. The Fernando Report of 1974, produced by UNESCO UNDP, identified a social pyramid representing extreme inequality that was also reproduced in the education sphere. It identified a large low-income group, quote, living in substandard rented houses, with the majority of their children not having the privilege of attending secondary school. A World Bank report study in 1979 assessed the education system as being ill-suited to the country's development needs, with inappropriate and outdated curricula, dilapidated primary school plans, and shortage of educational material. Other specific indicators of the condition of education in pre-revolutionary Grenada included 86% of the adult population had received primary school education level, and 92% of them had passed no exam. 65% of common entrance scholarships had been awarded to relatively affluent families comprising less than 10% of the total population. The 4 junior secondary schools in the system were operating at 56% capacity, with only a 20% completion rate. Practically all preschool teachers had no formal training in that area. 60% of the primary school teachers were untrained. 21% of secondary school teachers were qualified, and the 4 secondary schools in St. George's had 58% of the graduate teachers, although they accounted for 37% of the 10,247 students. In 1979, 22 qualified and 57 unqualified teachers left the system. The Teachers College output was 29 teachers. It was estimated that given this rate of attrition, it would take the country 30 years to achieve full certification of teachers using the existing Teachers College model. And finally, student performance. In 1978, 968 students sat the school leaving exam. Only 28 passed. The transition from primary to secondary stood at between 10 to 14%. And for Cambridge O-level exams, 87.6% of candidates received passes in 0 to 3 subjects, while only 12.4% received passes in 4 or more subjects. These statistics provide adequate empirical adumbration of the condition of education inherited by the revolution of March 13th and the fundamental challenges that they pose to any modernization effort, far less a revolutionary project. Having described this context, I would like to talk about education in the revolution, an exploration of the NGM critique of education in post-colonial Grenada and its prescriptions for its transformation, much of which was heavily influenced by the concepts of Ujamaa socialism espoused by President Nyerere of Tanzania. The Pan-Africanist orientation of the NGM evolved rapidly as the revolution increasingly veered towards Marxist orthodoxy, but the framework of education in the revolution remained culturally grounded. The conception of education in the revolution was derived from the NGM Statement of Principles, and you have a digital copy of that. 10 principles which focus heavily on people empowerment and the establishment of the right to employment, to social inclusion and participation, to health and decent standards of living, and the development of talent, ability, and culture. In its 1973 manifesto, the NGM identified those 4 explicit priorities for their education agenda, incorporating agriculture, fisheries, agro-industries, and tourism as curriculum subjects in the formal system, the establishment of free secondary education, the utilization of participatory approaches to textbook production, and the establishment of what they call freedom schools for adult education and skills training. All 4 of these priorities of intent, I call them, became pillars of education in the revolution. It is important to situate the effort and accomplishments again in that life cycle, the 1,681 days, because it can be asserted without any fear of contradiction that the inherited post-colonial construct more was accomplished in that transient historical episode than in any other preceding historical period in Grenada or the wider Caribbean, with the possible exception of the post-colonial transformation of Trinidad and Tobago under Eric Williams. There is a fascinating study, my wife likes to hear that Eric Williams story. There is a fascinating study waiting to be done on educational transformation in post-colonial states, focusing on the challenges of access and equity. Why? Because you can expand access within an elitist configuration in which you open the tap wider to allow more persons to drink. But that itself does not guarantee the right of all to drink. Equity, however, is not possible without increasing access. There was a palpable air of possibility and optimism that was fueled by the youthfulness of the revolutionary protagonists. As Wordsworth put it, bliss it was in the dawn to be alive, but to be young was very heaven. I miss my 6-pack. But Wordsworth was not there. Gavin Datambo Stewart, that's not what he looked like then, had the epistemic privilege of being there and young, and expressed it thus. And Gavin said, the present is changing. A new and bright future is coming into being. Let us go to close the door on that which is old and dying away. Come, let us go to greet tomorrow and feel at home in this new day. Education in the Grenada Revolution was a primary arena of ideological contestation. More than any other sector, any change initiative in education explicitly, more than implicitly, articulates its philosophical underpinnings. As Dewey previously asserted, it is only when we define the type of society that we seek to create that education as a social process and function assumes meaning. The core question of education transformation is what is the purpose of education in society, its outcomes, who benefits, whose knowledge is of the most worth. These are quintessentially political questions that are ideologically grounded. At a superficial level, these questions appeared to have been answered in the post-independence Caribbean. But the reality is that we have only tinkered with specific components of the system, but have never focused on the re-engineering of its elemental architecture. Maurice Bishop succinctly articulated the role of education in the revolution. He said the revolution of March 13th brought into being a new dynamic in education because it had always been a fundamental tenet of our party that the right to education was an inalienable and necessary one. Every historical process which seeks to improve the condition of the working people must provide for their educational and cultural development. In Grenada, our most precious resources are our people, and the process of national development is not simply an economic one, but also a question of the liberation of the cultural energy of our people. And because the frontiers of human knowledge are forever expanding, because the horizons of the mind are ever widening, education should be a continuous process. At the first national consultation on education in 1980, Morris further outlined 4 main objectives of a revolutionary education system. First, it attempts to teach people greater critical appreciation of their own reality so they know how to change it. Secondly, to develop the innate abilities of the masses of the people and not just entrenching the privileges of a few. Thirdly, to develop the productive capacity of the society, since it is only through expansion in production that the standard of living, including the education system, can be improved. And fourthly, it tries to promote the democratization of our society, the process by which people are encouraged to take an active part in the education system itself and in all major decisions that affect their lives. Now, just parenthetically, fast forward to the death of the revolution, one of the things I heard most frequently on the streets in that moment of crisis was people saying, all you bring CPE, all you bring education, you all bring participation. We have the right. Why is the party not consulting us now? We have the right. We were taught to think. And it reminds me of the admonition in a colonial document where some white colonialist was warning that it's very difficult, it is very dangerous to teach the Negroes to read and write. Because once they learn to do that, they will not stand easily in the old entrenchments of ignorance. The conception of education in the revolution was not a utilitarian one. It was not just about developing human capital for economic progress. You know, I hate to hear when in our contemporary discourse, everything is about skills development, developing the economy. We forget about the civilizing influence of education. Education was first of all defined in the revolution, first defined as a fundamental right of all. And it was considered to be a medium for cultivating consciousness, for shaping citizenship, for developing culture, and enabling empowerment. Another way of conceptualizing that conception is represented in this diagram. So you have education at the core. There's the citizen, the role of education is shaping the citizen, understanding, developing their innate human potential in all its dimensions. The ideal citizen, one who knows their rights, but you also know your obligations and your responsibilities. And you understand the obligations of history. Because there are a lot of things happening in this Caribbean today. If we knew our history, we would think and act differently. Our political system, the political and historical awareness, the question of participation in that system, the economy, developing the productive capacity, and at the level of family and communities, balancing tradition and modernity, unleashing the social potential. Now it's interesting that in 1980, the Grenada population in Grenada was 110,000. The Grenada diaspora was 300,000. The earnings from exports in 1980 were 44 million EC dollars. The remittances came to 41 million. That's why the PRG spoke about the visa mentality. The economy, the education system, the production system in Grenada from that statistic was not geared to develop Grenada. It was geared to export workers to other climates. That's why the visa mentality. So, every dimension of this broad conception of education carried implications for how education was to be delivered. Its modality, its structure, its methodology, its content, and its protagonists. If we examine the sphere of the economy, for example, we can see clearly how the conception of education in the revolution went way beyond the instrumentality of the school system to manifest itself as a process of knowledge assimilation and application, as a symbiosis of learning and doing, and of knowledge as a factor of production and an enabler of becoming. On the economic front, the revolution had an ambitious plan for modernization of the productive sectors of the economy. And remember, the pre-revolution was its 78 Crown Agents report, right? What it said about the state of the Grenada economy. So the plan of the revolution required putting foundational infrastructure in place, for example, the international airport, moving beyond the export of primary products to greater value-added export, ensuring food security, a slogan was grow what we eat what we grow, and creating avenues for the widest economic participation. And the formation of cooperatives at the time was seen as an ideal vehicle for this. Undergirding all of this was an infrastructure of training, research, and development. And that diagram behind me, remember, 1,681 days. All of that infrastructure was put in place in that period. So starting with the training, research and development, the revolution established a agro-industry multipurpose plant that was meant to start to put in place the infrastructure for value added going beyond primary production. And that linked right into the Mirabeau Agricultural School, which was training young people to become farmers. I know Chadel will be happy to hear about this. And Mirabeau Agricultural School was also linked into the Grenada State Farms. All the farms appropriated by Gary were pulled together in one state entity with the aim of making them productive enterprises, which also included profit sharing, by the way, for the farm workers and so on. But that linked also into the Marketing and National Import Board, which still exists today, so handle imports and also exports of produce. And the agro-industrial factory, 42 jobs created with its establishment. The agro-industrial factory in the first year purchased 205,498 pounds of produce from farmers. It earned $286,000 in nectars, jams, hot sauce. We needed canned tamarind, mango, soursop. Help me out here. All the gray-haired people, well, you know it. Those were the days. The forestry the fish processing plant with 21 jobs was established. Grenada started producing its own saltfish. A forestry development corporation, 87 jobs created. In the first year, 35,000 cubic feet of timber produced. And through the MNIB, vegetable export increased by 27% between 80 and 81. At the level of primary production, you had the Grenada State Farms feeding that value-added production. You had the Mount Hartman Sheep and Pig Farm, the Carriacou Sheep production, and you had the National Fisheries Corporation with 6 boats, ferroconcrete trawlers donated by Cuba to facilitate serious fishing, not artisanal. And then the research thing was the Mardi Gras Agronomy and Soil Conservation Facility. CADI had a field station, and the National Cooperatives Development Agency. Grenada did its first National Farmers Census and the first aerial survey of the agricultural sector. So here we have these specialized knowledge institutions utilize work-study training approaches in modern but appropriate technologies. They undertook some extension work with private producers, sharing experiences, etc. And there you have it. Here's the evidence of it. The farm schools in Mirabeau and La Sagesse, more land being allocated, $7.1 million for the fisheries project, the graduation of fisheries students, and our famous Grenadian saltfish. Not the sparrow kind. So, in the broad conception of education in the revolution, the principle of education as a basic right of all and as a prerequisite for holistic national development meant creating a different dynamic of purpose and structure in the formal education system, and that is what is represented here. In all of our education systems in the Caribbean, there's a pyramidal structure. You start at the base with wider access, it becomes more selective, access is more restricted under the fiction of ensuring quality. So you have exams that determine your flow from one level to the next. The two factors which created this dynamic was the requirement for education to develop people and build society, and a rapid paradigm shift from selective to universal access at all levels. So on my right, that pyramid there is what the traditional system is like. We have very weak early childhood development, even up to today in the Caribbean. But we have broad primary, almost universal primary education. Secondary education is still, although we've moved to universal, but there's still a loss of demographics moving from primary to secondary, and at the apex of tertiary education, even less access. Whereas the revolutionary conception was to have universal access, meaning a free flow. Now that is conceptually, obviously, people may not necessarily choose to move from secondary, but the access, the guarantee of access is what matters here. And you'll notice with those triangles, what we showed is integral to the conception of education in the revolution was that mix of the technical and vocational and the academic, with parity of esteem. So in the early childhood sphere, it's about developing the cognitive ability, but a lot of emphasis on play, on motor development, etc. At primary education, work study, project application, the foundational academics, and so it went up the chain. So having described the amplitude of the conception and the application of education in the construct of the revolution, I now want to turn to the revolution or the nature of the transformation in education itself. So the distinction I made in the title, Education in the Revolution, is how education in its broadest conception, not as a school system, but education as the development of the human mind, capacity and competence, was applied in the revolution across all sectors, economy, life in community, everything. But the revolution in education now, we are going to focus on the drastic changes made in the methodology of education itself. So, to illustrate the nature of the revolution in education, I want to explore 7 major initiatives which together paint an adequate picture of the extent of the paradigm shift in education that substantiate my early arguments about why the Grenada experience matters. And these 6 initiatives are the process of popular engagement on the transformation of education, the literacy campaign and the CPE, the National In-Service Teacher Education Program, the Community School Day Program, curriculum and the creation of indigenous texts, the democratization of schools, and other measures relating to poverty impact mitigation and learning enhancements. In general conceptual terms, the transformation of education in that period focused on 3 elements: the teacher, the curriculum, and the learner. Not the student, the learner. The focus on the teacher placed emphasis on the professionalization of the teacher with mass upgrading of primary school teachers through NISTEP, as well as specialized training for early childhood teachers and other levels of teachers, the involvement of teachers in the development of new curricula in core subject areas, and the shaping of a new pedagogy of engagement. The transformation of the curriculum centers around the challenge of content and the age-old question, whose knowledge is of the most worth? The 1973 NGM Manifesto promise of using participatory approaches to textbook production speaks to the engagement of teachers in the definition of content and the production of knowledge. We will see later how this was actualized in the teacher development initiatives of the revolution. So, the process of popular engagement. Between July and September 79, the PRG convened a series of consultations involving broad social and sectoral representation, educators, private sector, trade unions, churches, etc. 12 sectors were represented by 77 delegates, and 16 institutions or organizations submitted written reports and memoranda. 4 basic questions were presented to focus the dialogue. And the questions are, what kind of individual should the education system produce? Who should control the schools? What kind of school system should there be? And what should be taught and how? Virtually all of the organizations represented agreed on the need for some program of education change. The weaknesses and failings of the system were too self-evident. Following the first phase of the seminar, submissions were circulated to schools and participating organizations for comment. The feedback from schools was synthesized into a consensus of views which formed the basis for discussion and debate during the second phase of the seminar 1 month later. George Brizan, in a study, reported that 67 schools and organizations contributed to the consensus document, and that this document represented, to quote him, a most comprehensive view of the thinking, criticisms, concerns, and recommendations of those most closely associated with education, unquote. The consensus was particularly strong in 3 areas: teacher training, curriculum reform, and adult education. In the area of teacher training, it was felt that teachers should receive professional training, that the experience of qualified teachers should be utilized in the process, and that teachers receiving training should be bonded. The consensus over curriculum reform centered around the need for relevance, relating education to the world of work, and the need to standardize approaches in particular subject areas. And in adult education, the call was for the establishment of a national literacy and continuing education program. This is what created the impetus necessary to fire the public imagination about the changes in education, and importantly, it liberated the initiative of teachers at all levels. Following the consultations with teachers, which by the way was attended by Paulo Freire, a famous Latin American educator, a survey was conducted, and 76% of the teachers who attended indicated that on their own initiative they began to implement ideas coming from the workshop. The innovations introduced by the teachers fell into 6 major categories: cooperative activity, involving institution and revitalization of house systems, 4-H clubs, Red Cross savings unions, class susu, student councils, and increased group work in and out of the classroom. Productive activity, a renewed vigor in school fundraising activities, and expression of self-reliance by schools. It was reported, for example, that many schools have started or expanded tuck shops with students in charge of food preparation, selling, and accounting. Notice what's happening on the teachers' initiative in the schools. One school has been able to purchase a deep freeze, which pays for itself out of the proceeds of snow ice sales. Thirdly, creative and artistic activity. Increased activity in arts and craft, drama, music, and singing, with more attention given to indigenous folk arts. Self-help activities, mainly reflected in the involvement of teachers, students, and members of the community in continuing school beautification and repair efforts. In social studies, the content and objectives of the teaching of this subject reflected the orientations at the seminar and involved things like field trips to historic sites and development projects, and democracy in the school, sharing school and classroom responsibilities with students in order to develop a greater sense of responsibility and inculcate democratic values. In the Grenadian historical process, as in many other revolutions, a fundamental tension existed between democratization and centralization. The events of October 1983 were a tragic resolution of the contradiction between the centralizing authoritarian tendencies inherent in the NGM's characterization of itself as a Marxist-Leninist vanguard on the one hand, and the democratizing impulses created by the removal of the Giri dictatorship and the assertion of the people's jurisdiction within the transition state. The energy and enthusiasm generated by the engagement of everyone, not just educators, in the shaping of the education transformation agenda was a testament to the viability of that approach. We now turn to the literacy campaign and the Centers for Popular Education. This was the first major program of the revolution, and in announcing the campaign, Prime Minister Bishop indicated that the CPE is a critically important program because through the CPE, education, which was previously a privilege of a minority, will now be the right of all of our people. The launch was preceded by a parallel track undertaken. On the one hand, extensive and intensive public sensitization and mobilization that included panel discussions in literally every village in Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique. I can say without challenge that in that time I traveled every road and track in the full length of Grenada, Carriacou, but not Petit Martinique. I never got to go to Petit Martinique. And these discussions were on the importance of literacy to personal empowerment, community advancement, and national discussions. And they involve the most senior figures of the revolution, with some of us from the technical side. So Maurice Bishop, Bernard Corn, members of cabinet, the NGM Political Bureau, alongside prominent educators. Meetings were held with all mass organizations, all religious authorities, the unions, the private sector, and the Grenada Union of Teachers played a prominent role in this thrust. Massive billboards were erected in all parishes with slogans, never too old to learn, education a right, not a privilege, and the country was plastered with 30,000 CPE posters. A comic book illustrating the importance of literacy was produced by a local artist, Gordon Hamilton, and literal house-to-house visits countrywide, especially in areas of poverty concentration, to bring the message of the campaign to every home. The leadership team comprised Valerie Cornwall and myself as joint coordinators, with a Cuban advisor, Angel, we fondly call him Abuelo Arechea. On the other parallel track was the technical planning involving the structuring of the campaign and the preparation of all the instructional materials required. The campaign was structured, and this is my old notebooks from those days. The campaign was structured from the village level up with dual components. The mobilization side was coordinated by village mobilization coordinators, and on the other hand, technical coordinators responsible for overseeing the teaching process and providing technical support to the volunteer teachers. The only paid persons were the campaign staff at the national level. Members of the National Technical Commission, Yulan Soni, who's there, was a member of that commission, parish coordinators, technical, and mobilization. Over 3,000 youth and students, members of the public, teachers, committed voluntary time to help in any way possible, from teaching illiterate neighbors to organizing cultural events, sporting activities, village community work, all aimed at building a sense of solidarity and caring. An icon of the literacy campaign was the youngest volunteer, 11-year-old Lyndon Adams of Leicester, Carriacou, who taught his grandmother to read and write. The instructional material developed for the campaign reinforced the ethos of national pride and revolutionary effort. The 14 themes of the literacy reader, Let Us Learn Together, adequately summed up what the revolution was seeking to achieve. So here were the lessons, the 14 lessons. Let us learn from each other. We build our communities. Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique. I'm talking about them as one because these two appendages of the past were now part of the state. It's a pity you all didn't recognize that in the referendum. The land must produce more. One Caribbean. Free milk for mothers and babies. The revolution brings more doctors. Our international airport. NCB, the Bank of the People. I think that's what you read now, Richard. Building a new Grenada. Vigilance in our villages. Our history of struggle. Education is a must. And lastly, the revolution has room for all of us. The literacy campaign was a fire sweeping the spirit of the Grenada people. Initial and then regular training and evaluation sessions were held at the parish level. We produced our own newsletter to keep everyone informed of developments and the progress of the campaign. Emulation ceremonies were held every month to recognize learner achievement and teacher consistency. An unintended outcome of the campaign was the emergence of CPE cultural groups that led to a revitalization of the folk culture of Grenada, its songs, dances, and traditions, and a creative outpouring of poems, plays, and songs. So here's the Tivoli CPE cultural group and big drum dancers of Carriacou at an emulation ceremony. Literacy award ceremony. At the midpoint of the campaign and at the end, successful learners were given certificates of accomplishment at ceremonies presided over by the top leadership of the PRG. The campaign closed with a major rally, having reached 130 of 135 communities in Grenada, Carriacou, and Petit Martinique. It touched over 8,000 learners and received the nomination of the International Council for Adult Education for the 1981 UNESCO Prize for Literacy. The conception of the CPE was broader than the literacy campaign though, and it was the incarnation of the NGM's promise of freedom schools. Well before the end of the campaign, work had commenced on the establishment of a parallel system of continuing education whose aim was to turn every school in Grenada by night into an adult education center and ensure a seamless articulation of education opportunity for all. CPE to take you from wherever you are to wherever you want to go. The following chart sums up that configuration. So there were conceptually 3 phases. Phase 1 was the literacy campaign run by volunteers. The certification was the CPE literacy certificate. Year 1, the program was a 1-year program, basic literacy, but strongly linked to cultural animation. And it happened at homes, in communities, anywhere and everywhere. The second phase, which started after the literacy campaign ended, was done not by volunteers this time, but by paid trained teachers in the system who were given tax-free stipends by government. And you saw earlier some of the certification. We actually designed these certificates, so they were formal certificates issued to people. There were 4 levels of certification that took you from CPE level 1 to 4. Level 4 was the equivalent of the school leaving certificate. And then at the time, CXC had the basic exam. So we take you right up to CXC basic. Once you achieve CXC basic, then that's where you can look back into your aspiration anywhere in the formal education system. It was a 3-year modular program, again for residual illiterates, so it did literacy, post-literacy at the 4 levels. And the subjects in the 4 levels were English language, mathematics, geography, natural science, and history. And whereas the literacy campaign happened in homes, in community centers everywhere, the phase 2 of the CPE happened in schools island-wide. And then the third component of it, which is the continuing education, was where other stuff that I already described, like setting up these specialized institutions for training and development happened. And it was staffed by trained professionals. So a dedicated team of, and here you see the phase 2 centers island-wide, including Carriacou and PT Martinique. The dedicated team of Grenadian teachers worked diligently to prepare a consolidated set of 4 CPE textbooks. Unique to its time, it sought to integrate its themes. A reading passage on water in the English section, for example, would generally speak on the importance of water in our lives. But this was complemented by problems in the math section of the book dealing with water-related calculations. So, for example, a leaking pipe in Mount Morris losing 3 gallons an hour. How much is wasted in 24 hours? And then calculate the utilization of opportunity cost of that wastage. The water theme was continued in the geography section with sources of water in Grenada, importance of rivers, etc. And in the science section, on the science of water, its chemistry, its biological value, and its importance to life. In presenting these lessons, teachers were encouraged, and this is again a distinguishing thing. Teachers were encouraged to undertake real-life challenges, for example, having the class identify water wastage in their community. Go through your community, identify all wastage of water in the community. Invite and notify the water authority and arrange community labor to fix the leaks. The content of these consolidated texts were local, relevant, and applicable to the challenges of the historical moment in Grenada. So, for example, this is from a couple of the textbooks. Cunha was a humble, semi-literate worker who discovered a way of dealing with a beetle that was affecting, I think it was Grenadian cocoa, using the wood of the African and the secretions of the African breadfruit. And we made a big thing out of it. CPE helped make Cunha famous because he was an inventor. And that is, look at the paradigm shifts. An ordinary, humble worker, a subject of a text in a book, speaking to his scientific prowess. He wasn't no big-time scientist with PhDs, but observation, native intelligence, these are the things that we need to treasure and value and promote and cultivate. Besides Cunha's invention, one thing was on the international airport, which was a source of great national pride and mobilization. I think other than the CPE, the international airport was perhaps the thing that united all Grenadians across class boundaries, religious boundaries, everything. And boat building in Carriacou. So these were just samples. So I want to turn now to NISTEP. Teacher qualification has practically reached crisis proportions by 1979. 3 major reports between 1973 and 1976 all explicitly called for a new approach and a model involving in-service teacher education. So you have the Fernando report, the Goodrich report, the Clough report. And the NISTEP objectives were to prepare teachers to sit the UE Qualified Teacher Certificate, to raise the level of competence of classroom teaching. Because remember at the time UE was still a benchmark for teacher certification. To increase the level of achievement of children, simultaneous to the training of the teachers, develop a common curriculum, build a stock of material appropriate to training of teachers, develop and raise the level and quality of pedagogy, and upgrade the status of teaching as a professional career. Started in October 1980, NISTEP involved 534 teacher trainees, about 260 teacher partners who were qualified teachers who served as in-school supervisors and advisors to their trainees, and it was run by a staff of 18 full-time and 7 part-time tutors who were organized by subject panels. Classes were held 2 days a week at 3 central locations in Grenada and Carriacou, and teacher trainers were visited in school twice a week by tutors. In the first and second year, you see the 3 years, the subjects that were taught, as well as the preparation of a research study. In fact, the ministry even provided the NISTEP trainees with a list of research topics of interest to the ministry that could help us in obtaining empirical data for further planning. There is a tall tale to be told about the establishment of NISTEP and the institutional resistance of UWI Cave Hill to the paradigm shift that it represented, a classical case of the incapacity to recognize obsolescence. The university held hard to the idea of the teacher's college model in the face of all evidence refusing to budge. Not only was NISTEP the most feasible way to address the deficit in teacher qualification, but its design also addressed the need to engage teachers as authors of curriculum, as producers of new knowledge. Additionally, the financial bottom line was inarguable. Whereas the Teachers College model trained 90 teachers at an average cost of $5,600 EC dollars, NISTEP trained 318 at an average cost of $1,848. Further vindication of the program is found in the fact that when the first cohort of NISTEP trainees was ready to sit the UE practice exam, the entire faculty of the School of Education came to serve as examiners and insisted on adjudicating the work of the entire cohort, because instead of the customary sample, NISTEP recorded 100% passes in that assessment. Besides NISTEP, there were other smaller in-service initiatives. So they included 12 months upgrading program for 35 teachers who had been in the service for over 15, 20 years. They were over 40 years of age, so give them an opportunity to upgrade and retire at a different level. A specialized 2-year program for 60 daycare and preschool attendants, which also included registration by 10 community persons who were interested on early childhood development. And associated with these were the minimum entry requirements for the teaching profession at different levels, the establishment of a preschool healthcare program, and the promulgation of preschool code of hygiene. Certainly for the OECS, unheard of in that time. Preschool was just child-minding. So we turn now to the community school day program. The challenge here is, how do we keep schools open with hundreds of teachers out of school? When you have a substantial number of teachers in training 2 days a week, how do you keep your schools in operation? How could we cater for approximately 24,000 affected students in 66 schools? Closing school for 2 days a week was not an option, and the PRG made that frightfully and abundantly clear to us. The only feasible answer was to keep schools open and to find a way to make that learning open, flexible, and innovative. What if we invited parents and the community to teach, to mentor, and guide students in hands-on learning and doing? Thus emerged the CSDP, Community School Day Program. The Minister of Education, Jackie Kreff, threw out the challenge and defined the opportunity to students themselves. She said to them, this is your day to get to know your community. Go out to the factories, the historical sites, the beauty spots, the fishing beaches, the farms, the workshops, the agro-industrial plants. Learn from the people. Learn from the workers. Respect their skills, for it is upon their excellence and productivity that our society will grow and flourish. 5 objectives were set for the CSDP. Introduce students to the world of work in a concrete way. Be a productive participant in the process of national development. Make the school the focal point of the community. Involve the community and the students in the development of the entire locale. And to assist in the formulation of the new curriculum by integral links between school and community, experimenting with new ideas and experiences, and demonstrating the validity of these new elements in the practice of the schools. Although faced with immense logistical difficulties initially, the result was an exciting infusion of culture, skills, and eclectic learning in schools. So in trades, you had, often in conjunction to actual school repairs, students did apprenticeships in carpentry, masonry, plumbing, electrical, wiring, and so on. You had visiting lecturers from parents, the private sector, community organizations, career guidance. Some old people in parts of Grenada came to teach Creole, which was an almost dead language in Grenada then, indigenous dances, creative writing workshops with local poets, learning traditional crafts, conducting cultural research, field trips, including getting involved in minor restoration work, work attachments, the cleaning up of school surroundings, community cleanups, beach cleanups, etc. So what was the outcome? CSDP's more innovative activities included the organization of agricultural school gardens in 12 primary schools with funding from Oxfam Canada. Series of national exhibitions, including 2 exhibitions of student craft which traveled to Trinidad and Barbados. The sale of craft items produced by students through Grenada, which was the craft outlet of the revolution, with the proceeds going towards the acquisition of material for the program. And importantly, gender neutrality to trades and innovative subjects. So girls learning carpentry, masonry, engaging in what was formerly seen as largely male activities. Let's turn quickly to the curriculum and the creation of indigenous texts. In its most generalized definition, the curriculum is a body of prescribed or official knowledge to be transmitted, engaged, interrogated in the education process. In any attempt at education transformation, the curriculum must be problematized. Questions need to be asked about who prescribes, what is prescribed, why is it being prescribed, and at the center of it is the age-old question again: what or whose knowledge is of the most worth? So people talk about the explicit curriculum. There's the hidden curriculum. The hidden curriculum are things that unintended impacts of curriculum. In planning the curriculum development process, what again was different about Grenada is that we did not just look at laying out a formal curriculum, but looking at the unintended effects of that curriculum, how it went down in the social and cultural context of the country, and how do you start to change student attitudes and the receipt of that curriculum, the manner in which the curriculum was received. So the general principles of that curriculum process were outlined. What should we teach, what should be the content, and how should we organize it? So a strong focus on the local with broad awareness of the international environment, taking into account the national aspirations, Caribbean and national consciousness, whole person development. How we should do it, participatory process, teachers, students, national development stakeholders, make sure we suit the age and the stage, practical work, flexible, group and individual engagement. And then the guiding principles of that of that curriculum was outlined. Now, here we had the process, how the process started. The curriculum development process was a carefully thought out but highly participatory one. Teachers Speak, which was a compendium of ideas. Remember I spoke about a seminar, the first seminar in 1980 that brought all teachers together. This book, Teachers Speak, was produced from that, which listed all the ideas that teachers generated. And that became part of the Bible for the curriculum development, together with a survey that was conducted looking at asking teachers for their views on the new curriculum. The thinking that emerged from this was taken to parish level meetings with curriculum leaders in every parish, and was also discussed on a national special radio program called Moving On. The systematic work was then commenced on the English language and the maths curriculum with the use of a children's page shown here in the Free West Indian to disseminate the evolving work. So it was a way of field testing the work, but also as a work in progress, sharing it, getting feedback, improving what was being done. Merle Hodge was one of the thought leaders and innovators in this process, and she explained the dynamic between the curriculum of subjects and the shaping of new subjectivities. So Merle said, the language arts program can be seen as an important means towards fostering the kind of democracy that Grenada has set itself as a goal. Now notice, everywhere else in the Caribbean, when we talk about language syllabus or curricula, we're talking about just the technical mechanics of the language, learning English properly. But here in Grenada, they were talking about self-expression, the habit of discussion, the gathering of information through the printed word, the ability to analyze information and forms one's own opinion. These are some of the skills that are necessary for the exercise of democracy. She further explained that critical thinking was necessary to give meaning and purpose to education. And I quote Merle again, one could place other areas of the curriculum in the same perspective. What ends are to be served by the subject called history? What ends are to be served by the subject called history? Will the subject called history continue to impress upon us how insignificant we are in the scheme of things? We have to do some serious thinking about what we in our part of the world mean by or mean to achieve by history, by geography, language arts, etc. We have to adjust not only content, but also methods to the objectives that we set ourselves. Often, it is how things are taught rather than what things are taught that will make a difference. For example, the use of group work and cooperation rather than individualistic competition, the practice of discussion, give and take between teacher and pupil pooling their knowledge and ideas rather than the teacher perpetually handing down information to passive students. An outcome of this process unfolding across the education system was the genesis of indigenous texts and publications, and this is only a sample of what I have in my collection. Between CP, NISTEP, and the Revolutionary Publishing House, Fedor Books, a whole generation of literature evolved. Lastly, we come to the other measures. So, let me just scan the landscape quickly, because we had the international student councils, integral part of the governance of schools, but helping to students to learn accountability by assuming responsibility. This is a scene from International Students' Day rally. And I think this is Tali Francis, who was then president of the National Students' Council. The other thing was the move away from the PTA, Parent-Teacher Association, to the formation of community education councils. And that was a consequence of the CSDP program, because with community members getting so involved in the school was no longer just the parents and the teachers. It was the community. So repositioning the school and bringing all of these actors to bear in that effort. The other measures relating to poverty and impact mitigation was school feeding programs in the schools, a back-to-school campaign that was concerted and all over the country to ensure that every child was in school, with penalties for parents keeping kids away from school. You had access and equity measures. There was a progressive reduction of school fees. Remember, the NGM promised free education. So from 1979, fees were reduced to $50 and then to full abolition in September 1981. Free universal secondary education. The junior secondary schools, which were a limbo land of nothing happening, were converted to full and proper secondaries, creating 800 spaces in secondary schools. Education reform as a dual access equity measure, introducing standards of measurable learning. Examination reform. So we formed the National Examination Board to properly reconfigure examinations. And one of the things, Grenada had fallen into the practice of total multiple choice exams. And in fact, the parents derisively described that as the shading thing. So you're teaching children to just shade bubbles. And here now we reintroduce the essay writing, reading, oral reading, and so on as part of the test. And then tertiary education access, the establishment of the Institute for Further Education. That was a precursor to TAMCC, and incidentally, they're celebrating their 40th anniversary this year. I'm told that by Roberts that there's going to be a reunion, so all IFE people. Now, just as a side note, I remember sitting with Jackie Kreff and discussing where do we go with IFE, and the thinking there was that we need to locate a campus in St. David's, a huge campus, and we actually had discussions with the Soviets about totally financing a state-of-the-art higher education institute. As a compromise to their generosity, it was going to be named LIFE, the Lenin Institute of Further Education. And then an unprecedented scope of scholarships. Cuba, the GDR, the USSR, but also importantly, India, Canada, the US, the Commonwealth, areas like engineering, agronomy, economics, medicine, education, a whole range of areas. You can say in that time that tertiary education was practically free. I now want to end, I'm not finished yet. Daycare. By 1981, the revolution had built 7 pre-primary schools and 1 nursery and repaired 14 pre-primaries. School repair program, this is a scene from Mount Morris. In the first 2 weeks of January 1980, the PRG sponsored a school repair program, the first major repair drive in 25 years. 5 out of 62 schools were in good condition. 12 were slated for demolition. The private sector donated material, paint, food, estimated at $1 million. 4,000 plus volunteers of all ages worked weekends and after hours to clean, paint, repair, and renovate school compounds. The estimated value of community inputs, $2.3 million. New secondary schools were constructed in rural parishes with a very strong focus on equity to rural areas. In 1983, 3 new primary schools were opened in St. John's, St. Mark's, and St. David's at a cost of $2.1 million. 40% of the school buildings in Grenada were built prior to 1930, with poor maintenance by state or denominational boards. The denominational boards own 74% of the primary schools. The estimated cost of the needed reconstruction was $6.5 million. School furniture was equally acute, with reaching crisis by 1982 because we needed 11,201 units. And when I say unit, I'm talking desk and chair as one unit. The PRG sourced $50,000 US from UNESCO and opened a line of $780,000 line of credit from Cuba to supply 37 primary schools, 4 secondaries, 2 junior secondaries, and 20 preschools with furniture. Weaknesses in science and technology learning. lab improvements in all secondary schools, and late or early 1983, the negotiation of 14 teachers, science specialists from the Soviet Union with master's degrees in science to teach and upgrade the caliber of science teaching in the secondary schools. So that was 1,681 days. Peter Drucker said the best way to predict the future is to create it. Where would we have gone beyond the 1,681 days? In a report by the Minister of Education, Jackie Kreff, to the Central Committee of the NJM in July 1982, we identified 14 strategic goals on a 20-year horizon. The first was the transformation of curriculum relevant to national development, accomplishment of universal secondary education, functional literacy for all up to O and A levels, institutionalization of political education in schools, continuous training for all teachers, universal pre-primary education, institutionalization of work study, institutionalization of community education councils, island-wide technical and vocational training. We had actually started setting up technical institutes in each quadrant of the country so that to be specialized institutions, schools would be bussed in because we couldn't afford to have one in every parish. Island-wide national appreciation and application of science and technology, national testing, evaluation and research system, centralized training through IFE to become live, full university, zoning of all schools, and full state control of education. Now, let me just end. So this is the story, as I said, of the 1,681 days and nights of work in the arena of education. Regardless of one's ideological perspective, the most neutral questions that can be extracted from the Grenada experience is the simple lesson of the magnitude of the transformation that can be accomplished in a short period of time once you have decisive political will, a deep process of consultation that taps the public creative imagination, and the value of citizenship engagement for creating disruption, a competent technical apparatus energized by commitment of bringing results to the people, and a systems design perspective that sees the interconnectedness of things and optimizes this in shaping solutions. Now, in this presentation, I sought not only to describe education in the revolution, but also to explicate the nature of the revolution in education itself, how the process of education was fundamentally changed. This historical drama was not an even and smooth process. It was a fascinating kaleidoscope of shifting currents, finding consensus at key points, but at the same time, let's not illude ourselves, it was an intensely contested arena of ideological struggle between distinct interest groups. There's a lot more that needs to be said on the nature of the contradiction in the processes of educational change. Because despite the virtual unanimity of opinion on the necessity of some of the most prominent educational initiatives of the revolution, there was considerable contradiction about the extent to which they achieved their objectives, about the approaches and the content that they embodied, about the ideological orientation that they displayed. These responses showed that people can hold simultaneously contradictory positions, that confronted with so complex a subject, the reaction of different social actors can embody the contradictions of the process itself. So that in one interview I had, an opponent of the revolution expressed the view that given a choice over which programs to implement and which to scrap, he would have implemented all, but change their motives. Don't know how you do that. To what extent can we realistically separate the educational programs of the revolution from its ideology? One of the emerging arguments is that, first of all, the ideology of the Grenada Revolution was not, contrary to what opponents of the revolution tried to make it, a monolithic outlook. Within the revolution, there was the party perspective with its Marxist-Leninist orientation, but there was also the participatory impulse that the party itself led in the communities. The ideology of the transition state may have an identifiable orientation, but it is essentially a worldview in search of itself. It is an evolving arena of consciousness in which the received dogma is interpolated by the pragmatic reality of the society in which it is being developed. Cultural constraints, the configuration of power, the weight and tempering force of tradition all conspire to shape the ideological outcome of the historical moment. Secondly, it is possible to trace within the dominant ideological trends which tendencies provide the impulse to creative action and which ones fetter the emergence of imaginative responses to the dilemmas of transition. One certainty is that no educational reform is ideologically neutral. Even the blandest expression of nationalism in what Fuller calls the fragile state conceals an agenda of incorporation. The central issue in unmasking that agenda is to ask, in whose interest is that agenda constituted, by whom, and by what means? These questions point us to the dynamics of power in the transition state, but they also help in making sense of the multiple perspectives that contend with each other. Does it take a revolution to make a solution? Some have lamented the fact that there have been such strong negation of many of the positive aspects of the revolution, and wondered aloud whether it takes revolution to achieve some of the things that the Grenada Revolution had accomplished. This was not necessarily so, but what is definitely needed is a strong organizing principle around which the national and social will can be mobilized. The Grenada Revolution unquestionably provided a strong social and political principle around which it sought to organize Grenadian society. In the sphere of education, the eradication of privilege by the broadening of access to education at all levels and the free provision of education are the significant and most memorable features of education under the PRG. Thank you.
A few questions.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jules, for your authentic, comprehensive, sorry. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Dr. Jules, for your authentic, comprehensive journey to the past. 1,681 days. You have indeed provided an ocean in our organized desert of forgetting. You reminded us whose knowledge is of the most worth, and what kind of individual should the education system produce. You reminded us of the philosophical maxim, education is not the filling of a vessel, but the lighting of a flame. Thank you very much for this very rich, indeed rich, journey through time. We will entertain a few questions for the next 15 minutes or so. So I invite you, the mics are there, identify yourselves and direct your questions to Dr. Jules.
Okay, Maslin from Union Island. You mentioned about the systematic failure in education. A few years ago, in St. Vincent, we introduced what is called the education revolution. When I first heard about it, I was very elated. But later, a few years later, I realized it's a system that is failing us in that it's all about up, up, and out. The children will do the common entrance exam. The results determines which secondary school they go to. But whether they pass or fail, they will go to a secondary school. And in the end, we're seeing students graduating secondary barely able to read and write. So the emphasis is no longer placed on literacy and numeracy. And I get the feeling that our institutions somehow is lowering their standard, and I'll explain why I say that. Whether they're lowering their standards to look good or to cover up for the failure. For example, when I did CXC many years ago, grade 3 wasn't a pass, but today it is. In our college back in St. Vincent, 40% is now the pass mark. So my question to you is, do you think that in the Caribbean that we need an urgent conversation in the restructuring of our education system? And who, in your opinion, need to spearhead these discussions? And secondly, you gave us, you showed us a pie chart with a study from CXC in terms of the CXC results, the passes. Was any additional research done to determine at what period during that 20-year span the breakdown in the system started, and was any study done to determine what caused that breakdown? Thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Okay.
Or we take another two and then you answer, or you prefer?
No, I prefer to take it
one at a time. Good.
Yeah. First of all, let me say that the situation you describe is not unique to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. It's all over the Caribbean. And I think that situation exists because we have failed to take the further step of asking the hard questions about the inheritance that we have, the post-colonial inheritance in education. Remember I made the point about access and equity. You can extend access, but not change the equity equation. But you cannot create equity without improving access. Now the challenge for policymakers is to really look hard at performance in the system and to understand that performance is not just the capacity of teachers or the ability of students. There are also systemic factors that determine performance. And until you address those systemic factors, you're not likely to get fundamental change in what is happening. That was one of the reasons why, when I was at CXC, we started the Caribbean Primary Exit Assessment, because that exam is more than just an exam. It is a different methodology that brings together assessment, learning, and teaching in a different nexus altogether. If you're familiar with it, you will understand the real difference that it makes. So I'm hopeful from that perspective. With regard to the conversation about change, again, for years, I was at CXC for 7 years, and for 5 of those years, we kept prevailing on CARICOM on the need to have a special meeting of the heads of government to look at the crisis in education in the Caribbean. When they finally agreed to it, we produced a study that showed that pie chart you saw with the CXC thing came from that study. And what emerged from that was the CARICOM Human Resource Development Strategy, which is our best attempt so far to make a difference. But the question is whether member states will absorb the prescriptions of that strategy in their national policy. So I really, I'm not that optimistic about the future of education in the Caribbean because a lot is changing, and in the rest of the world, we're talking about the fourth industrial revolution. And the things that we require to do, we have to, while we're talking about computers and the digital revolution and all of that, there's still a need to go back to basics, right? Let's put it this way: if you learn math, if your ability in mathematics is predicated on the use of calculators, what happens when there are no batteries, right? So there are fundamentals that we need to master. The process of modernization, while at the same time accommodation and the mastery of basics, is essential. I think that's all I choose to say at this point.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Jules. Any other question or comment? I see Richard Duncan. The mic, because we're recording, yes. What?
Thank you. Excellent presentation, Dirkus. I often wonder whether or not the conversion of the junior sex into full secondary schools, which you mentioned, was not an error on the part of the PRG with respect to skills training, which is what I believe the junior sex were initially designed to do. Your response?
No, I don't agree with that. The problem that you speak to is not related to the conversion to full secondaries. It is our conception of what a secondary school should be. Because the reality is that the junior sex, not only in Grenada, but all over the Caribbean where they were funded, because this was funded, I think, by the British or the Canadians, I'm not sure. I think it was the British who brought in the junior sex concept, and they financed them. But this was a half-baked idea, and these schools were neither fish nor fowl. So very little was happening in the schools other than some notion of skills training. And the problem with the skills training was that it neglected the academic development of the students. So we have this dichotomous view of education. If you can't learn with your head, then you need to learn with your hands. Now, the real answer to this dilemma you're pointing to, I believe, is the creation of comprehensive schools. Because in St. Lucia, for example, the Canadians funded a series of comprehensive schools. They call them the Maple Leaf schools. And in the comprehensive schools, you had parity of esteem between all the academic subjects and the technical and vocational subjects. To this day, 30 years later, the Castries Comprehensive and the other comprehensive schools are some of the most sought after schools in St. Lucia, because you can be very bright in all the academic subjects, but you still do carpentry, woodwork, technical drawing, and in fact, a lot of the best technical people in the country, technical professionals in the country today, are persons who've been through that system. So I think this is what we need to change. And you see, part of the problem is that at the back of our heads, no matter what we say about modernization of TechVoc, there is still the ideology that technical and vocational is for people who can't learn, right? I went to a world conference on technical and vocational in China about 5 years ago. And what I saw being portrayed as technical and vocational in China, we would not recognize it. Because it is impossible to do that TechVoc that the Chinese were displaying without a strong mastery of mathematics, science, other subjects. So really, we have to restore balance to the education system. And again, it speaks to our mechanistic approach to education, and we believe it's all about the economy, it's about skills, right? Or it's about academic highfalutin stuff. No, it has to be balanced. Now you look at the World Economic Forum reports. What are they saying are the most needed skills for life going forward? It's critical thinking, design thinking. It's all about subjectivities, your capacity to think. Because the capacity to think is what will give you mastery of any subject that's thrown your way. And that is where we are failing.
Thank you. I saw Dr. Patrick Antoine, and then Kennedy Roberts.
Thank you, Dr. Jules. Great presentation. At the time, of course, being a student at IFE myself, I identified much of what you've said, and of course, sitting there, a lot of what we experienced, I now understand from the policy perspective. So, the real issue, though, is that I want to advance that what is important today is not what we've called political will, but political action. In fact, that which you've presented as one of the reports that you and colleagues would have had the opportunity of presenting to heads. I think that's important as a benchmark, but leading from your previous comment just before I took the mic, having regard to the fact that there is a view that the Caribbean has fallen behind, and that when you benchmark us against students and education systems in other parts of the world, the marks are not high for our region. What are perhaps 5 touch points that you would point us to as strategic things that we can do if we are to improve our education system in the next decade? I heard your previous comment in terms of your own pessimism on it. But if we are to turn that around as a people, tell us 5 things that you would do today that would make a difference in the next decade. Thank you very much.
Very good question.
Boy, Patrick, trust me to ask some hard questions. Well, the first thing that jumps to mind is early childhood education. Because all the studies, especially recent scientific work done, shows that between the ages of 0 to 5, the cognitive capacity of the human mind is really seriously established. And any failure to pay attention to that really stymies your opportunities going forward in life. So I think we need to pay serious attention to early childhood. The second thing would be, in a way, some of what was done in the time of the revolution, a focus on teachers, because we have to upgrade and upskill the teaching profession. Teachers need to be brought to a different level of engagement as professionals. And I'm not just talking from a remuneration point of view. I think the remuneration thing will come. And that's where I believe some of the unions themselves are failing, because they just focus on the money side of the equation. But, the respect by way of money will come if you gain respect as a professional and you show the results that a professional brings, right? So I'm saying this, that we need to upgrade the teaching profession, and it's not just money, as I said, but selection. How do you become a teacher? In places like Singapore and Finland, you don't just leave school and that's the easiest job you fall into. You have to there's a process of selection, right? And the selection process is not just your academic credentials, but also your disposition, some of the competencies and the characteristics that you show. So that's the second thing. Associated with that would be looking at the enterprise of education has to be handled differently. And I think that maybe the remaining 3 things could be wrapped up into this issue, that our approach to education needs to be fundamentally overhauled. And by that I mean, make the school the center of focus of the education system. Ministries have to understand that their job is they exist to serve the schools.
Exactly.
So that paradigm shift has to happen. Parents have to understand what is their role in the system as co-coordinators of the learning journey of their kids. So, think back on what I just described in the revolution. The whole process of engagement and participation has to go wider and deeper than just teachers, parents, and the school. It has to be a whole society effort. And again, maybe it doesn't just take a revolution to create a solution. You look at the history of education reform in places like Finland and Singapore and so on, and that's what was done. A guy called Phil Salzburg, who was one of the architects of the Finnish reforms, when asked what was the single most decisive thing that was done in Finland to make it number one in the world in education, he said the focus was not on excellence, it was on equity. And that's what got them there, equity. And that's where we're running into serious problems. I remember seeing, to my great dismay, when I was at CXC, I think throughout the Caribbean we had that challenge, but it's most manifest to me in the Jamaican education system. That there was a report in the Grenada saying that a private preschool was having an entrance exam to select students to enter preschool. Now, that to me is one of the most frightening headlines you could see. Because what happened? So, first of all, there's the filter there is wealth, right? Can you afford to get into that school or not? And even if you can afford, what can your child do? Now, a preschool, come on, preschool is fun, it's games, the whole Montessori thing. What will be the nature of that exam? So my child goes into a private preschool. The logical thing from a private preschool will go to a private primary and into a private secondary. And then you go off to some elite university. You are being channeled in a groove of elitism, right? When I went to school, and that was a big argument I had with my professor in Wisconsin, because the Americans have these weird ideas. They were saying that, we were discussing school uniforms in a session one time, and they were saying, oh, kids must, be allowed to, it's a free thing, you dress as you please. I say, listen, uniforms are not regimentation. Because where I come from, the child of the richest person in St. Lucia and the poorest sat on the same school bench, and they were dressed exactly the same. As a matter of fact, the child of the poorer one was cleaner and better dressed than the rich one, right? So that's why the whole thing on equity. So I think that's where I would take it, Patrick.
Yes. While Kennedy Roberts comes to the mic, I want to really recognize Dr. Merle Hodge, who came to this conference from Trinidad, a regional leader worker. Merle, take a bow. We thank you for your contribution to education reform. Dr. Jules did mention you with NISTEP. You were what I would call a leader worker, and we want to recognize you and thank you. Yes? Good.
Thank you, Benedictus. I realized throughout your presentation you didn't make any reference to St. George's University, at the time the School of Medicine, while it was here. Was there any interaction, any information you could give us on that relationship during that time? And based on where SGU is now, what role you think they can really play in achieving some of the vision you would have for education in Grenada in particular?
The strange thing about SGU is that when the NGM was in opposition, from all the literature I saw, it was resolutely opposed to the offshore school, because I guess Gary brought it in and a lot of politics around that. But the reality is that once the PRG got into power, I think there was a recognition of the contribution of the school in the economic ecosystem. There was also, in a way, a recognition of the strategic presence of the school, in the fact that you had so many Americans there, a feeling that perhaps the U.S. would hesitate to invade if you had American students, not because they were going to be held hostage, contrary to some of the propaganda I've heard. But the reality is that the first, although the school was established by Geary, the first formal agreement between the government and St. George's was signed by the PRG. And that opened up access to St. George's, which was formerly an enclave institution by locals to get scholarships and so on. And that was done by the PRG. So fast forward to, I can't remember how many years ago, when Clarice Charles was Minister of Education, I was asked by her to assist with the design of the SPEED education plan. And in doing that work, I crunched some numbers and made a suggestion. The World Bank had done a report that showed that the market for medical education was growing by $6 billion a year. And that internationally, St. George's University and Ross University were the two largest contributors to medical, trained medical, doctors from offshore sources to the US. So looking at those figures, it struck me that with that growth in the market, if Grenada was, St. George's were able to capture even 1% of that market growth, it could put it in a completely different location. And the suggestion there was that we made in SPEED was that the government provide all diplomatic and other support to St. George's, including providing whatever land it required for its expansion, and put its diplomatic connections at the service of the university for its marketing, its outreach, and so on, in return for which the school would provide free access to Grenadians. And by my calculation, you would probably not need more than about anywhere between 1,500 to 2,000 places a year, which would be minuscule in cost compared to what you would earn from capturing a larger slice of that market. Imagine at that time, Grenada and Ross University in Dominica were the largest providers, even beyond Israel and Singapore and these other places, of medical skills to the US. So I think the University, St. George's has a very critical role to play. It already is part of the economic landscape. I understand it accounts for more than 20% of the GDP of Grenada. But I think more than just its contribution to the GDP is the opportunity to leverage St. George's as an institution of international repute, but also treat it as a national university with a greater articulation with opportunity in the country.
Well, I saw a hand here first, and then we have two more questions. Yes, I saw your hand. Then Damien Greaves, then Chris. Yes, we need the mic. In that order, Damien Greaves and Chris Riggs.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Louise. I'm from Grenadian born, but I was sort of educated in London, and I'm an educator by profession. I'm a lecturer. I specialize in Caribbean cultural history and literature. And I just want to say this, your seminar touched everything that I did on my dissertation. I did the Geary years and the Grenada Revolution. But my point is this, in listening to you, I observed two things. I observed that education is power, and I sense, maybe I'm wrong, you can correct me, I sense that the revolution was using education as a very powerful tool to educate the people, to bring them to a state of consciousness whereby they could understand the revolution, work with the revolution, and take it forward. Because you cannot have an uneducated population to support a concept, a theory, or a movement. But I see a contrast here with the present situation in Grenada right now, and I'm not afraid to say it. I can see that we have a fantastic country. Our education is in a mess. We have no central library. We have no libraries in the district. I have visited a lot of schools in Grenada, and I've seen the state of some of the schools. I wouldn't even send my dog to some of the schools. I work as a special needs support teacher in one of the villages here. Children come to after school club at age 7, 8. They can't read, they can write. And they have homework that they don't understand. So I personally believe that our present situation is dumbing down our young people so that they can control them. It's a different concept of power. Power control. So when you stupefy the nation, you can control them. Okay, right. This gentleman asked how you can give him some ideas to move forward. There was a time when there was something here called the diaspora situation. A lot of us came down from England, Canada, Russia, Germany to several conferences here a couple of years ago about education. We in Britain was given the strategy or the program for education. We said we'll work with the government, we'll come and exchange, we'll teach, we'll do everything, but we won't give them money because we've sent so much money to Grenada to help education and nothing was done. So to hear you, to see the state of Grenada right now is embarrassing. I see young people on the street of Grenada drinking rum. I see young girls just having babies with nothing to do. And I see our country talking about tourism, talking about citizenship by investment. I know for a fact that our young people will become slaves in a few years' time because the people, children who are born to the new citizenship by investment, they go to private school. I know because my friend run a private school and a lot of them come to it. They come to after-school lessons, right? These children, you don't see them on the street idle. They have private lessons. They're preparing them for the future, for the later. What would happen to our young people? Sorry, I'm very emotional on that. I want you to cry listening to you because I can see how backward. In England, I went to school. Okay, I took my time to study Caribbean cultural history. I came down here, researched, do the revolution, do the guerrillas. I did it for my double masters. I did a language and sociolinguist of Grenada, and I came here, and I'm embarrassed. I'm telling you the honest truth. So I'm emotional, yeah, because I can't bear to see the state of Grenada education. So this is what I have to say. Okay.
So that was a comment. Do you wish to comment on that, or?
Well, I mean, I have to respect her view and her feeling about it. I guess it comes from a certain expectation of what should be. But as the former registrar of CXC, I can tell you that Grenada in many respects is ahead of the rest of the OECS. So I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? In terms of how you judge it. But I say this based on certain empirical realities, right? That first of all, it was the first country to adopt the CPE that I referred to earlier, the Caribbean Primary Exit Exam. And it's almost 10 years now since Grenada is using the CPE, which replaced the Common Entrance. Now that was a dumbing exam, right? The old Common Entrance. And what has happened is that the performance of Grenadian students, the mean, has jumped by double digits in that 10 years. Now, this is not just idle statistics because, you know, in an ordinary exam, you could say, okay, you had improvements by double-digit movement, and it just means that students are cramming better for exams. But the nature of the CPA is a completely different thing. Just to quickly give you an example. You know, the old Common Entrance was do or die. 3 hours of exams, you get a judgment, where you pass determines which school you go to, etc. In the CPA, 2 years before what is the Common Entrance exam, the teacher starts a process with their class of learning that involves project work. So for example, in English, the teacher would discuss what are the elements of a good essay. And students discuss it, they agree on those elements. Let's pick a topic, okay, a trip to Carriacou. And then students will have to write a short essay on that. After the essay is written, every child gets up and reads his or her essay to the rest of the class. So you don't just have to write an essay, you read it to the class. The class critiques your essay, and then the teacher sends you back to rewrite it for as many iterations until they're satisfied that you meet that standard, right? But what is happening here is that not just the teacher's judgment, but engaging students in critical reflection on their own work. Then at some point, obviously children are at different stages. So your essay maybe by the second iteration is school, the teacher is not satisfied with mine. She'll say, you work with Didicus to help him get his essay correct. So the faster and brighter students are helping the slower ones. And psychometrically, the work done by CXC shows that students learn even better from their peers than from their teachers, right? And what happens then is that the first iteration of the essay, the middle iteration, and the final iteration goes into a portfolio. So this happens in English, in maths, in science. The revolutionary part of the thing too is that the class discusses the rubrics of a good exam, and they are asked to design their own exam questions in English and maths. And then the teacher takes these questions, student-generated questions, and creates an exam paper which they sit. After the exam is written, they exchange papers and they mark each other's paper, and the teacher moderates the results. Again, psychometrically, what was shown by the CXC examination of that was that the validity of student-generated tests is surprisingly close to the validity of teacher-generated tests. Now, so that kind of methodology being used over 10 years in an education system does begin to make a difference. Now, obviously, so there are encouraging signs of what is possible and how we can begin to move the needle, right? If I may just also say, and don't take this in the wrong way, sometimes, or often, certainly from my St. Lucia experience of the diaspora, there's often a disjuncture between persons from the diaspora and locals, in that, you've been brought up, you've been socialized in an American or British system, you see certain standards of things, the quality of the schools, the facilities. People have sometimes expectations that are not necessarily real in the context of the local environment, right? So I think we need to bear that in mind. I'm just making that suggestion that you keep that in mind in terms of what your expectations ought to be, but more importantly, to recognize the difference between education in the UK and education in the Caribbean, and therefore how might you more meaningfully direct your energies to positive improvement of the system. Yeah.
We offer freely, we don't even ask for money.
Yeah.
And if you say we don't need you.
Yeah.
All right, we respect all views, yes. If I may say before Damien Graves come to the mic, something beautiful happened in this Caribbean in a few generations. My 4 grandparents would not have recognized their names on that wall just a few generations ago. They were on the plantation. When we look now at what has happened to the Caribbean, sometimes we knock ourselves and we don't realize that the glass is really overflowing and it's not half empty. But I recognize what you're saying. Recently I was told that in a Caribbean country, students go to school by shift. Some start 7 and end 12, and the others come in from 1. A shift system of education. So when we look comparatively, we'll get a better sense. But there's a lot more to be done in this country and in the entire Caribbean for the transformation that we need in the education system. So we respect the views that you shared. There's a lot more to be done, yeah?
But when you quickly, as you mentioned, the shift system, when I was PS education in St. Lucia, the 2 most primary schools in greatest demand in Castries were the Ave Maria and the RC Boys, 2 Catholic primary schools. And because of the demand, they were placed on the shift system, which was supposed to have been temporary. And for 18 years, these schools were on shift. When we went into the ministry, we did a study to see what was really happening here. And it showed that a child entering Ave Maria or RC and doing their entire primary span, by the time they left, they would have lost the equivalent of 1 year of schooling in terms of contact time because of the shift system. So the solution there was to get rid of, build a new school to accommodate it. And that too is another story, because the approach we took in building the new school, and that's how sometimes the lessons of Grenada multiplies itself in many and sometimes unknown ways. A lot of the work in my career that I've done has been heavily influenced by Grenada. When we had to build that new school, we had visited every school on the island with the minister and taken copious notes of all what teachers said was wrong with the building of schools in the country. So the brief to the architects contained all of these notes. For example, teachers said every school, once a school is over 500, it must have a playing field, it must have an auditorium. To build an auditorium for a school of 1,000 kids would have cost us $3 million. We designed the school as a hollow rectangle and cantilever the roof over the hollow with large corridors so that all the students could sit in the corridors. It's called the Dame Poulet Primary School. If you go to St. Lucia, check it out. For $350,000, we provided an auditorium that could hold the entire school population plus the parents. Yes. And that's because we listened to what teachers had to say.
Dr. Jules, and then Chris DeRiggs, and
Dr.
the next
Jules?
one on the hand. Sorry,
Jules?
sorry.
I don't mind, I need his brains. But DJ, those were the days, what you talk about St. Lucia, but tonight is a great night of reminiscing for you, isn't it? Right, but there are some things I want to draw to your attention, DJ, and perhaps your days during the revolution as PS in education and initiating or helping to develop that great program could help us answer some questions now. One, I am extremely concerned about the whole idea of the slow learner in our schools and the whole idea of certain psychological situations in terms of the development of the child, like dyslexia. We have a fundamental problem not only in Grenada but in other parts of the Caribbean, and I want to talk about the OECS, where we are not identifying those students in the classroom. And from the time that we deal with them, we have already made them failures. So I think we need to start looking at this issue very seriously. People who sit in the class cannot necessarily understand what is going on, does not have the capacity or the skill. They're dyslexic, they have other learning disabilities, and we have not done anything to deal with that. How did the revolution deal with that? Maybe at that time it was not a prominent issue, but now it's certainly a very prominent issue, and I have concerns. Secondly, I believe that even our university may in fact be failing us, our universities may be failing us in this regard. I am seeing students coming in now who do not have basic skills, but more importantly, cannot critically think, cannot critically analyze, who have a breadth of knowledge which is 1 mile long, but 1 inch deep. And that's phenomenal. Such that I have made the decision to transform my style of educating or teaching. In fact, I always tell my students, first time I encounter them, I am not the sage on the stage, but the guide on the side. Because I want them to understand that education must be a partnership. It must not be me sitting at the mic or sitting on the stage or at the podium and pontificating. It's a partnership that we must now allow them to understand and to make the contribution and see things through their own youthful lenses while we partner in terms of my own senior lenses, if you want to put it that way. So the emphasis now, but I think we have to move away, and we are looking at that very critically, from what some people have dubbed the karaoke style of teaching. That you put up the slides and you just read them off and say, okay, students, thank you very much. And what they do is think that they must go and regurgitate. I think now we must have the students to think deeply about themselves, about what they attack in terms of the curriculum. So the emphasis now should be on critical thinking, not just knowledge, not just information passing. Yes, they are basic things, but we must now find a way to have them to interrogate the material, to see how they feel about the material. It must be an emphasis whereby we move into Bloom's taxonomy at the highest level, right? And we must now look at what you said before, the attitude. Not just the aptitude,
but the attitude. And also look at the whole business of application. So now, when I teach at St. George's University, my students will tell you, I don't just look at knowledge. I mean, knowledge, you can go and read. What I want you to do is, what I want to teach you or to imbue you with is how to attack that material and critique it. How to criticize it, how to build on it, how to apply it. Because I believe at the end of the day, I believe in Brunner, you can teach anybody anything at an intellectually honest age. Thank you, DJ.
Very good.
Yeah, well, with regard to the school learners, I mean, in 1979-80, the question of disability was just more, it was not as prominent as it is now, let's put it that way. But the revolution did pay attention to special ed schools, and there was particular assistance coming from Cuba especially in helping to address those concerns. But I want to point you, Damien, to a TED talk by Sir Ken Robinson. I'm trying to remember the name. I think it's called The Education Revolution by Sir Ken Robinson, TED talk. Because Sir Ken, somewhere in that talk, is discussing a sort of, one of the points he makes is an overdiagnosis of disability. And I think while we have to deal with disability, but we also have to be careful not to follow some of the Western modes that are happening, because people, he was talking about the overprescription in the UK of Ritalin for attention deficit disorder, ADD. All of a sudden, all students in the system showing signs of ADD, and he said they're numbing them to stupidity with the Ritalin that's being prescribed. So we have to be careful about, following some of those narratives where they go. In fact, I have a friend who I work very closely with when I was PS Education in St. Lucia, because she has a son who is autistic. And a lot of our discussion had to do with, while everybody is focusing on autism as a serious or even severe disability, the reality is that autistic children also have sparks of genius.
Yes.
So the discussion we were having, and we were trying to really get to somewhere with it, is how do we turn this on the head? How do you address whatever may be the debilitating effects of it, but at the same time find those sparks of genius and use that to hype it up? There's a St. Lucian guy who suffers from this problem, and he is an artist. He flew in a helicopter over London, and just one flight circling London, he then reproduced everything he had seen in the most amazing level of detail. Right? And there are many stories like that of autistic children who have phenomenal memories or phenomenal capacity in something. Now, imagine in the Caribbean, our version of a special ed school is that, you have all these like dumb kids who are disabled, and so you do what you can to help them survive and cope. What if we have instead institutions that looks at the opportunities of genius, the points of capacity that they have, and we enhance that, right? And help them to live not just better lives, but the lives of genius.
Yes. Very good.
Just one other thing. The other thing about with your point about critical thinking, you remember the quote I had from Merle when, as a thought leader in the curriculum development effort, right? That's a very crucial point, because again, Singapore has just abolished subjects. Finland, has abolished subjects. Now that sounds crazy, but it's for the same point that Merle was making way back in 1979. We have to interrogate what is the meaning of subjects. I remember having an argument with a prime minister in the OECS, because he was saying to me, we have to put critical thinking as a subject in CXC. And I'm like, well, Prime Minister, my last reading of subjects is that mathematics properly taught is critical thinking, science properly taught is critical thinking, English literature is critical thinking, and by the way, we do English language, which is English A in CXC, and English B, which is supposed to be literature, which is the reason they call it A and B, is two sides of the same coin. Everybody is doing English language, but nobody is doing English literature. So how can you appreciate the finities, the fineness of language and its exquisiteness and, the best examples of it if you're not doing literature? And English literature is critical thinking in English. So that's a very serious point, understanding history. What are we teaching history for? Like Merle said, if our history is just going to reinforce in us that we're just appendages of empire, then it's of no use to us. If history helps us to understand who we are, where we have come from, the reality of our true history, and the resilience that it embodies, then it enables and empowers us with more than just critical thinking, but the ability to thrive in a very brutally competitive world.
Okay. We take the two final questions. I saw Chris DeRiggs, and then is that Dr. Burt Prophet? Yes.
Good evening, Didicus. It's nice to see you. There's a time you used to have a lot more here, but...
and a lot less weight.
Okay, well, there is an appalling lack of knowledge of history among our students. And it may surprise you to know that even students at the level of TMRHO Community College do not know who A.J. Blaze was. And it takes me to your point about organized forgetting. And let me suggest that some of this forgetting is imposed and some are self-imposed. Because memory can be very painful. And indeed, as a coping and survival mechanism, we sometimes black out some chapters and phases in our history. But if you are saying that education should have a values base or some kind of ideological foundation, and it will help to inform us to answer the question what kind of society we're trying to create, then it seems to me that a knowledge of history is important to a realization of identity. So, in this state of affairs where many of our students are being educated and thrown out into a universal market where they become faceless and anonymous, with no sense of connection to the roots and the origins and any responsibility to bring development back home, or even to have a concept of home. So the question, is this an argument for going back to basics in the sense of a need for a curriculum adjustment that teaches history and more or less a history that identity studies, something like that?
Well, it's not just an argument for going back to basics, but we also have to interrogate the character of the basics, because, to say let's teach history in our schools, which is not happening right now, but then when we go to teach history, we're still teaching that Columbus discovered the West Indies and the Caribs were cannibals, and the Grenada Revolution appears nowhere in that history. In fact, because of the pain of the demise of the revolution is all the more reason why it should be front and center in the history curriculum here. Because everybody knows the saying that those who ignore the past are condemned to repeat it.
Good. All right, the final question, Dr. Burt Prophet.
Let me first of all just extend congratulations to the organizers of this series of events, and say to you that I think the challenge now is to take some of what we have been seeing I was only here for 2 sessions, but what I presume has gone on for the first 3 days, to take it out into the broader community, because I think there's a serious lack of in-depth discussion about contemporary issues in our society, and it is very important. To our speaker, I can only say I'm not sure where you had all those lessons about the educational, what went on during the PRG period. Through our many discussions over the years, I was able to learn a lot more from you tonight. Now, the PRG was born out of a period of the 70s with all the Black Power, etc. Today, in my opinion, we are approaching another period which is not just going to be regional, it's international. And it is likely to be having an impact on the very systems that we have become used to. My question to you, Dr. Jules, is how can we now, and what were your suggestions in the broad sense of the educational process, go about trying to get our young minds, and in a sense, it's in addition to what Chris was just saying, more integrated into this whole process, more understanding. You know, one doesn't feel a sense of urgency in our community about what is happening around us. And one day we may just suddenly wake up and find that in this new dispensation, we are way back down the ladder again.
Thank you.
Well, Tony, to tell you the truth, I'm not sure what the answer to that question is, because I'm a founding member of an institution in St. Lucia called the Folk Research Center. So when we were in Form 6, we went around the country with a Catholic priest. We did research on the folk culture. This eventually became an institution that had the largest repository of audiovisual and written material on the folk culture of St. Lucia. Stuff that, traditions that have completely disappeared, we had recorded on VHS and so on. And for 25 years, I was arguing with my peers about the need for us to digitize that stuff. Instead of it just sitting on dusty shelves, to convert that into educational material, the need for us to reach out. Now that all of us are becoming toothless and gray, that's when people are now talking about what can we do and why aren't young people involved in the culture and so on, So it's really a sad thing. I think a lot of this, we have really failed the incoming generations, and yet we complain about young people and the fact that their fixation with the digital and so on. We have to marry the technologies of today with the need to understand the fundamentals and the basics. And it's how we raise our kids sometimes. Parents use TV as a babysitter. They allow iPads and so on to go out of control. I know parents who allow fixed times. There are times with their kids when, it's no iPhone time, it's no iPad time, it's no TV time. Connect, right? They bring them on hikes, they do things with them, they connect in other ways, right? We're really losing it, so I don't know. I think a lot of it is our own feeling. I had a friend of mine who has a good relate with his kid, and he went to a fete with him, and he said all night the guy and his friends are on their cell phones. So he's talking to them, and I say, well, look, all these nice chicks in the party, why are you not interacting? He shows him he was chatting with 4 of them in the room on his cell phone. They all in the same party, but he's pursuing 4 women on the phone. And at a certain point, I guess he will strategically decide what time to dance with whom to take it to the next stage. But, these are some of the things we have to contend with,
Okay, I didn't see. Oh, you okay? Okay, all right, good. Well, I want to thank Dr. Didicus Jules for this very detailed lecture this evening, Education in the Revolution and the Revolution in Education, and for his responses to the questions as well. I think we are enlightened, we have a deeper understanding of that period, and more so, what then do we do going forward? So we really want to thank you for accepting our invitation and for enlightening us this evening. Yes. As I wrap up, a call was made today for a fund to establish an archives in Grenada. Maslin Lewis from Union Island, after her presentation, we've been having so many pictures and so forth, and some people actually started to donate. We will set up an account. We'll put more information on this on the website, www.grenadarevoconference2019.com. Thank you for that idea, Maslin. I want to thank our sponsors, St. George's University, the University of the West Indies, Grenada Cooperative Bank, and the manager is here with us, Embassy of the People's Republic of China in Grenada, Netherlands Insurance, Citizenship by Investment, Grenada, Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, Computer Information Systems, National Insurance Scheme, Ariza Credit Union, Flow Grenada, Grenada Spring Water, Belmer's Insurance Brokers Limited, Mary Rose Gardens, and Big Mac Enterprise Limited. We really want to thank them for their contributions to make this conference possible. I want to thank the student liaisons and Professor Antonia McDonald for the hard work they've been doing for the entire day, and they're still here with us. So thank you very much. And I just want to remind you again, tomorrow, May 29th, had Maurice Bishop lived, he would have been 75. We're having a plenary tomorrow morning, 10:30, in his honor, the life and legacy of Maurice Bishop. I'm inviting those of you who can attend to do so. At 1:30, we're having another plenary, Voices from Within. I'm inviting you, if you can, to attend. And the final plenary at 3:30, History, Memory, Reconciliation, and Healing. So thank all of you for coming out this evening, and we have to continue this conversation as we commemorate, celebrate, and critique the Grenada Revolution. Thank you.